Welcome to the Head Teacher Chat podcast, the podcast for school leaders that make you want to think harder and lead better. That's really what our mission is about at Head Teacher Chat. Today, we've got something that sits in the heart of every classroom in every school in the country: adaptive teaching. It's not just a buzzword, not that something just belongs to the SENCO. It's about the whole school culture, and one that begins at the very top of the school and reaches into every child. My guest today is Andrew Young, and Andrew is a social science teacher and a co-director of Pathfinder's Teaching School Hub that specializes in designing and delivering professional development. He has a particular interest in the friction between policy and practice. If you don't know, he has written this fantastic book about adaptive teaching, and I've read it for about the third time over the weekend, just getting ready for this podcast. And in my view, it's the most practical, honest treatment of SEND and adaptive teaching I've read in years. So, Andrew, welcome to Head Teacher Chat.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Jonathan. And yeah, thanks for that very high praise and positive feedback. I really appreciate it.
It is such a well-researched book, and I can tell where you come from with all this. We'll explore more of it in the podcast, because I haven't read a book like this for quite a few years about SEND and adaptive teaching. And I read it and I thought, there's so much most school leaders could take out of it and use in their own schools. So I was delighted to do the review and you to come along and do this podcast, because it is so vital that school leaders know about it. So, title of the book, so let's set in the scene for this. The title of the book, Culture to Class, that's the order. Culture first, classroom second. That feels deliberate. Why does culture come before the strategies?
Yeah, and that's, people talk about that phrase, culture eats strategy for breakfast. But what I hear increasingly more now is people saying you can strategize for your culture, right? You can put the strategies in place to embed the kind of culture that you want to see realized. Yeah, when the book has come from a really successful CPD program that we've been delivering for about 5 years now. And the program, we've been blessed to have funding for it. More recently, this academic year, it's been funded through the DfE RISE Universal Offer Initiative for Yorkshire and Humber. And we've had funding for it in local context in the last few years. And we've delivered it loads. And in a lot of places, it's been really successful. And in some places, it hasn't. And I think what's important about the question of culture to the classroom is when we typically see that adaptive teaching training is not effective and not implemented well, is it's not thought about clearly enough at the level of leadership in a school or a trust or an organization. So in order for adaptive teaching, like the strategies of adaptive teaching, like modeling or dual coding, setting inclusive homework, these strategies will only get so far and only be so successful unless there is that sense of the wider work that's done through the leadership avenues of school to bring that inclusive culture through to the classroom. So the book is really looking at 4 key ingredients, and it starts with culture, and then we unpick the culture of inclusion in terms of definitions of adaptive teaching versus differentiation, picking how schools should move to a system of having positive language around SEND and not deficit language around SEND, exploring the social model of healthcare and the social model of SEND more so than the medical model, so that we stop seeing the person as the problem and see the barrier around them as the problem. So once we get these kind of hallmarks of inclusive culture in place, we're then ready to understand more around brains and how we develop, and how there is a lot of cognitive similarity that runs through a lot of the diverse conditions that exist in the classroom. So that section of the book on brains is all about 4 of the key conditions that we see in a mainstream classroom, understanding them through the prism of the big 3: working memory, cognitive load, executive function. Once we get that understanding right about how we learn and those key areas, we're then ready to start looking at the strategies, to which there are quite a few in the book. And the more teachers understand about brains and how people learn, the more they can accurately deploy those strategies when they need to, how, and in the right place at the right time. And then it finishes, we have culture, brains, teaching, and then we finish on curriculum. And that's perhaps the most proactive part of adaptive teaching around. Let's get this right from the start. Let's think about a curriculum that is extremely ambitious for all learners, but is accessible by design. And so we finish by looking at areas of inclusive curriculum design. So those I see as the kind of 4 key ingredients that really just take your pedagogy, take your approach to teaching and learning from the culture all the way through to it being enacted in the classroom.
And it's so good. There was one line in the book that just called out to me, and it's this one, is that it's not the pupils that need fixing, it's the barriers around them. And actually, that's an important message for any school leader listening to this podcast. It means shifting the medical model to a social model of SEN, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think great schools and great leaders, they're really good at that. Naturally, we can do that quite well in the school context. We understand our children and their families, and we recognize those wider environmental, social, economic barriers that can exist around people, and we can think about how we're going to reduce, if not remove, those barriers. But we often operate in schools in our wider ecosystem where maybe external agencies and the healthcare system that exists around us are not operating in that social model, and they operate more around the medical model. So the challenge for us is to think, how do we stop ourselves or our teachers or our families from pathologizing too many young people with additional needs, so that we can take the emphasis away from the label and think more around the barrier that exists around them, because that feels like something you can actually fix, or if not fix, have the permission to learn more about, and how we might be able to remedy that. And the issue with a label, especially a medical label, is it can sometimes mean this is unfixable, it's unchanging, and it's something that we can't ever do anything about. So it's a good message for all of us to get into.
It's such an important message. One of the other things that I've noticed in the book as well, you describe the gap between Ts that have had adaptive teaching training and ones that have not had adaptive teaching training. And what does that gap actually look like in the classroom, really?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think, and I've just been lucky to hear from this person recently at a conference, is somebody called Daisy Christodoulou. And what she was talking about in her presentation, she's just put a Substack blog out on this as well, which is really interesting. She talks about the fundamental mission of ensuring that our teachers have knowledge, and that knowledge is the pathway to skills. And what a lot of teachers need is really secure mental models of things like cognitive load, working memory, executive function. The more we know that stuff as teachers, the more informed we are about how, when, where, and to what extent we deploy these key strategies. So what we've seen a lot of in the last, I guess, sort of 5 years or so, is a lot of these very headstrong early career teachers coming through with really good knowledge of adaptive teaching, really good knowledge of cognitive load, understanding the difference between extraneous cognitive load, intrinsic cognitive load, and how to optimize cognitive load. We've seen ECTs with really good head knowledge of working memory and the functionality of the 2 stores that exist on either side, with one in the middle of your working memory. And they get that and they understand it. But the flip side to that is we've got a profession where over 50% of the people in our profession are those that have been in the job for 10 years or more. And if you've been in the job 10 years or more, like me, well, when I trained to teach, we were told about learning styles and the importance of injecting those into every lesson. We were taught about differentiation being something that you should think about at the end of your lesson plan, and millions of different worksheets for millions of different kids. So there was this kind of like gap between people like that and people like ECTs with that great head knowledge. And so what we were wondering, will we start to see this when we put the program together about 5 years ago, and I think we have in a lot of areas, is would there be this disconnect of head secure, headstrong ECTs with good knowledge, but maybe not seeing that stuff modeled to them by experienced professionals in the sort of realms of adaptive teaching, what that looks like. So would there be a little bit of a knowing, doing, sustaining gap because of that disconnect? And to an extent, I think that probably has happened in a few areas. And that was the reason why about 5 years ago, we put our adaptive teaching program together, because we're like, the early career framework, the ITT core content framework had just been amended by the DfE at that time, back in 2020. Adaptive teaching is named as standard number 5 in that framework. So we're like, actually, if we don't do anything here, we're going to have, this is going to become more and more of a problem. So that's why we put the program together. That, and also to meet the needs of what was going on in schools at the time, and still to the extent today.
It's interesting. And I'm probably in an older age group than that, when about just SEN and what I trained with. It was an interesting time. I've gone through the whole system, and it's great. And in some ways now it's so developed, it's so researched, and it's actually, we need to train more people in what adaptive teaching really is. So what do you think is the most common misconception in schools operating adaptive teaching at the moment, when they're thinking it's taught well?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's so many areas where I think you can dig into this. So I'll give a few examples, and feel free to probe a little bit more if you want.
Okay.
I think one misconception of adaptive teaching is that you always need to adapt. And this is going to sound quite controversial given everything I've just said, but sometimes differentiation will need to happen too. And what I mean by that is, if adaptive teaching means ensuring that the high standards are in place for all, and to support some pupils, you might need to just modify what you're doing a little bit to help them reach that curriculum goal. Differentiation, I guess when it was initially conjured up, probably was more or less the same thing, but it's been lethally mutated, and whether we like it or not, as a term, it's come to carry negative connotations. So for a lot of people, they just see differentiation of doing different things for different kids that leads to different outcomes. And that's where differentiation went wrong. So adaptive teaching has come in as this kind of solution to that. Actually, we're not doing different things. We're supporting all learners to be a resource to reach the kind of curriculum goal. But differentiation, sometimes if you're in a small mixed age primary school setting, like I was up at a school a few weeks ago, and it was a school of 39 pupils, 39 kids in the whole school. You've got 2 classes, one is Key Stage 1 and one is Key Stage 2. That teacher there, when I saw it in the Key Stage 2 lesson, she was doing some incredible adaptive teaching. She had all of her pupils from year 3 to year 6 accessing a really high quality text, and they were all accessing it and engaging with it. And that's because of the adaptive teaching principles she put in place. But if you go back into that lesson later on and they're doing maths, actually at this point, because of the curriculum and the complexity of this being a mixed age class, you do want the children doing different activities and different tasks because of what they need to be able to do and engage with in terms of the content of that. So sometimes it's okay to differentiate if you're in that kind of setting, but it always needs to be thought about really judiciously and carefully so that you're not withholding the curriculum from too many children. But that would be one, I think, misconception that's got lost in this. Go on.
There's 2 that highlighted for me on this in the book. It's just good teaching, and then the other one was, it's the SENCOs job.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
common things that happen and said in our community. The good teaching one, actually, that's a myth, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it is. And I think some people will look at the hallmarks of adaptive teaching and think that is just good teaching, isn't it? And it's like, the reason why I think that's a misconception to say that adaptive teaching is just good teaching. I've got a bit of beef with that, basically. I'll unpack this. First of all, by throwing out this suggestion of it's just good teaching, what is just good teaching? What is good teaching? when we're working with teachers, we know that when we work with in professional development, teachers, just like us, just like learners, just like children, we need concrete language so that we can absolutely be able to recognize when we're doing something successfully and when we're not. And if you're saying to somebody in a school, guys, we want you all to just teach well, you're like, well, what does that mean and how does that work? So that's one reason why I think that's a misconception, because saying just good teaching, it's too reductive, it's unhelpful, it doesn't qualify what we want to happen in the classroom when we're thinking about supporting the needs of some of our most vulnerable pupils. And there's more to it, right? But adaptive teaching, it's not just about the kind of in the moment teaching stuff. When we start to get into the definitions of adaptive teaching, we're able to recognize all of that other stuff that we need to appreciate, like what it means to be both reactive and proactive when we're adapting our teaching. And we can get into the kind of hard thinking that's required when we're thinking about being reactive and responsive to our children's needs, and thinking proactively around designing out unnecessary barriers and hurdles to children's learning. So we're able to think harder about this stuff when we think about adaptive teaching versus just lumping everything together into just good teaching.
So, yeah. Though the other part in the book that I was really interested in was about labels. And actually, you're saying that labels are necessary, but they're not sufficient enough for the teacher or anyone working with the children to actually really understand what's going on. So you're using those bigger lenses to look at how children operate in classrooms. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that this goes back to one of the other things you pulled out earlier about the SENCO and not everything being the SENCO's responsibility. And I think it connects into that as well. So yeah, labels, a mantra that I've got in the book is that labels are necessary, but they're not sufficient. And for teachers, we can recognize that a label will give you a part of the story of a child and a part of their identity, but not everything. And what great schools and leaders will do is they'll create systems in their school to support teachers to think like detectives and to use their kind of key teacher noticing skills to think, okay, so a child has, for example, dyslexia. In the nicest way possible, like, so what? What else do we know about this child other than this label? Because a label can be a really poor representation of what a person actually really is and who they are. So what great teachers will do is they will recognize that's the tip of the iceberg, and they'll look beneath the surface to see some of those underlying barriers that exist to that child's learning. So, okay, they have dyslexia, but I'm noticing, because I've been teaching this child for a while now, that it's to do with their phonological processing of where they've got some barriers and challenges. They have strengths in maybe visual processing, and that's going to be useful. But I'm noticing as a teacher that my strategies need to be thinking about supporting that child with their phonological processing. So we're thinking harder than just that label that exists. So teachers are the best people to be able to do this. And actually the SENCO probably isn't. If you're thinking of a large school or even a small primary school, how can a SENCO possibly know every child in the school across every subject, across every day of every week, and where that child is experiencing success and where they're experiencing failure? It's impossible. So what great schools will do is they'll resource and equip teachers to be able to do that thinking and that diagnostic work, to look beneath the surface and think like detectives about each child in their class, to think about what strategies need to be used and when. So not just fixating on the label, but thinking more about what the barriers look like around that child.
That's so important, isn't it? That really just important that actually the teacher is the most important person to know that child. They're with the child all the time, especially in a primary school. They understand that child more than everyone else in that school. So the other concept I'm really interested in is being implied, and the idea that a teacher responds to the pupil's needs and send unspoken messages about how they can see that child. Do you want to give a little example of that? I think that's quite important for school leaders to understand.
Yeah, okay. So one of the things that we always talk about when we're doing our CPD on adaptive teaching in the first session, when we're thinking about the culture around inclusion, is the language that we use. And education, we're so bad for language and deficit language.
Yeah.
Not only are we bad for the kind of categories and names of things that we create, like disadvantaged, pupil premium, free school meal, these labels that we create, but it's the way we talk about them as well. Like when it comes to send, I wonder how many of the listeners to this podcast ever come across people saying things like this in their school. Send kids, send pupils, he's send, she's send. Why do we use language like this when it's so deficit based and not asset based? So let's say that again, like special educational needs and disabilities kids, special educational needs children, or he's special educational needs and disability. It's really perplexing, isn't it? This language that we use. And we'll use it around families, we'll use it around pupils, or he's ADHD or she's got dyslexia, as if it's this thing that is them rather than is something that sits within them and the rest of the child that comes with. So I just think language needs to be something that we have to think harder about in the culture and the ethos that we put in place in our school contexts. Because some people say, does it matter? Is it just semantics? But I think it isn't semantics. It's about dignity. It's about respect. It's around setting the right culture and framework that we want in our schools. And ultimately, what we say is coming from how we think and feel. And these things can inform the kind of actions that we put in place. So if the language we use around things like send is only ever problematic and negative, how far is that going to become a problematic and negative attitude that we have of the children that have those labels attached to them? So that's something that I think a lot of us could do with thinking more about, is the kind of the language that we use. And another part of this is I get really a bit cross really when I'm visiting schools or speaking to teachers, and in front of the children, they'll be referring to them as set 5 or set 4, set 3, set 1, 2, whatever. And you think, to what extent are we not helping children here? The way we talk about them in this way of being set 5 kind of a class or a set 5 child, like that's just so limiting, isn't it? The kind of expectations and attitude that we're throwing into the mix when we talk about our children in that way. So yeah, lots to think about there, but I think language is really important.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, actually, I don't think it's changed over the years. We've been talking about this for the last, I know. I've been talking about. You say that adaptive teaching cannot and shouldn't be rely on one or two lonely teachers who need to be driven from the top. What does that look like in leadership behaviors? Is it, if it's not just policy? Okay, my question was adaptive teaching is not only just for the lonely teachers in the classroom, it has to be driven from the top. What does it look like in leadership behaviors where it's not just policy?
Yeah, this is important because for adaptive teaching to be effective, and sometimes where I see it lethally mutated in schools is where it's not driven from the top, and it needs to be. And we've got to find ways of distributing the leadership of SEND as much as possible in the day-to-day of school life. I guess I'll just give you a few examples, just boring stuff to start with, but really important, like what are the meeting structures like in schools, and especially big schools like secondaries. It's great when you...
Lives, meeting structures. I used to go into schools and the first thing I used to do was put a structure in for every meeting.
Yeah.
It was, sorry, I just had to so resonate with that.
sore subjects for you there, Jonathan. Yeah, it's so important though about if you think about time, just never on our side in schools, is it? But we've got to systematize how we do things in our meeting structures from the day-to-day in school. So the SENCO, are they a part of the senior leadership team, first of all? Great if they are, but that's not even the kind of the end point, really. Is the SENCO involved in the meetings that exist around teaching and learning? Is the SENCO involved in meetings that exist around professional development that's been planned for next academic year? Is the SENCO involved in curriculum conversations that the curriculum leader is having with other colleagues? The SENCO that will have that kind of head knowledge and the really super practical knowledge around what's coming back from termly reviews, EHCPs, that side of knowing the children, that SENCO could be a really good mechanism for just further enhancing what you're doing in terms of some of those core strands of school life. Another way of supporting teachers to better understand children and their needs is by thinking about some other areas of the meeting structures that exist over the year. And that is the children who typically have one meeting a term, if they're on your inclusion register, your additional needs register, and children that maybe don't have an education healthcare plan, but they are down on your register as SENK, which means that they've been identified as having some kind of additional need or barrier to learning. So they've made it onto that additional needs register, but they've not yet failed upwards to a point of being able to get an EHCP. But most of the time, these are the children that you've got the biggest volume of children on your additional needs register that have SENK next to the name rather than the EHCP. In a big school, like for the SENCO to follow the best practice advice of the SEND code of practice, you really should be meeting with that child and ideally their family once a term. But if you're in a big school, that could be like somewhere, when you put the EHCP meetings into the mix as well, that could be around 600 meetings a year, right? That's a mega amount of meetings that you're expected to have as a SENCO. So what great schools will do is they will distribute those meetings to sit with class teachers or teaching assistants or support staff. And that's something that we're really proud that we do in the school where I work a bit of my time at Archbishop Holgate School in York. So what we've done over the last few years and what quite a few schools around us are doing more of as well is you take all of those children that are on the list as SENK and you distribute them to members of staff across the school. We use Part 1265, so the directed time that exists across the academic year. We allocate some of that directed time to each member of staff so that for once a term, they have an hour on a Wednesday after school to sit down and meet with the child that they've been allocated on their list, if you like. And something amazing starts to happen with that. And I can say this as somebody who's seen it across our school, across numerous schools, but I also have a child that I meet with once a term. And I love it. Like, I absolutely love it. So what you do is you sit down with the child. I actually bring the whole family in, and the family that I've got, I love them. They're brilliant people. The last meeting we had, they brought me some Turkish food, some baklava, because they heard that I love Turkish food and that's their heritage. So we sat down and we literally ate food together in the meeting. And we had a conversation around the year 9 pupil that we're supporting there. We talked about her wins and her successes in school, where things are going well and why, because we start to recognize like that's important. We build on strengths, not problems. And then we start to think about, well, where are things tricky for you? What kind of things are you doing to be able to access the curriculum? What kind of things can we be doing to support you in accessing the curriculum? And then I pull all that together and I just I update her pen portrait, her pupil passport, if you like, and that just gets shared in the system we have with the teachers across the school. This is a great example of distributed leadership of SEND, and it has ripple effects with how it helps us, because not only is that great for that child because she feels seen, heard, connected, supported, she's flourishing. It's great for me because I'm learning more about what it's like to be a child with these needs. And I'm learning more about, oh my goodness, I need to start doing these kind of strategies more in my own teaching because I'm seeing how they're helping this child, and it's bringing me closer to the kind of practice as a teacher. So I start to learn more about adaptive teaching just by having these conversations. We're connecting up with families. And it feels like there really is a team around the child in that kind of universal offer. So that's something that I think a lot of schools are moving towards, but it's definitely a way of ensuring that the area of SEND isn't just sitting with one individual.
Oh, it sounds like a great idea. It sounds like also you're understanding what's happening on the ground as well to give you more of an insight. And actually, everyone has then a part of that journey, aren't they? So you're all understanding that journey, and actually you can get so much knowledge and understanding from what the school's like from those sort of things.
Yeah.
Sounds like a great idea. I wished I did it in my school. And the next thing is about leadership then. It's going on with this thing. What you say that leaders should have learning check-in with and taking stock on where the children who are not active or present in their learning walk through what exactly that looks like and what are you looking for, and why do you think school leaders would have to do that?
In what way? Sorry.
I was reading in the book, if children are not active in their learning, the leaders need to know why, really, isn't it? And
Yeah.
that's the starting point. Rather than having all the labels and things like that, it's sort of like a check-in of what is actually happening with those children.
Yeah, definitely.
In some ways, it's trying to what is actually happening. Yeah, and maybe you think there was another thing I was going to say. It's actually I was talking to Teacher Tap the other day, the people who create it. I know we were having one thing about there was an interesting question that they put in their survey, and they said, if you had one area that you would like more teaching and training practice in your CPD in a year, what would be the one thing that you would like? Now, considering the previous question, they said that one of the things that they find hardest is SEND and adaptive teaching. The CPD is, they actually had the answer of, I would like to know more about my own particular subject that I'm teaching. It wasn't actually about SEND. So there's a bit of mismatch of how we can do it. That teaching and learning improvement is actually teachers don't actually want to improve. They want to improve on SEND, but actually they find out the hardest one as well. Is that a common practice that you find?
Yeah, I've seen some of this stuff from Teach Tap as well. Yeah, it is. So I'll do my best to unpack this a little bit and go back where we started with what leaders might be doing when they're checking in as well. And I think that's important. Yeah, it's good. We'll try and do all of that because it all comes together, definitely. So I think one of the things that I often see and recognize in the work that I do with schools is, and I think we're doing probably too much of this across the system, when it comes to teaching and learning, we're now at a point in a lot of schools where we're creating these kind of non-negotiables or principles. And this school, these are the principles of teaching and learning we want in place. And you come up with maybe Rosenshine's principles of instruction or something similar, or 6 key things. And then when we're quality assuring that in schools and we're walking around, we're doing our teaching and learning check-ins, we're walking into lessons, what good schools will do is they won't just look at the tick list of, yes, they're doing a strong start, or yes, they're doing the bell work activity, or yes, look, they're clarifying understanding because they asked the question, or look, they've got a hinge question on the board, so they are doing what we're asking them to do. That's part of it, isn't it? We need to be looking to see if teachers are rowing together and if we're aligned on key strategies. And I don't want to dispute that as being anything but really important, right?
Yeah.
But when we're checking in on lessons, we shouldn't just be checking in on the kind of strategy that the teacher is deploying. We should be looking at the pupils too. And we should be looking at how all of the pupils, to what extent they are participating in the lesson. So not just that with one eye on the teacher and the kind of what we're seeing there in terms of the strategies they're putting in place, but another eye on, and how's that landing? What am I noticing about the pupils in this class? I did a learning walk recently with a few colleagues in a school, and we walked into a science lesson. And what I saw in there was a teacher trying to explain something to the class, and ask some questions as well. And what I noticed from the pupils is a very high level of disengagement. And what I mean by disengagement, I mean that quite a few of the pupils were just rocking back and forward on the chair. quite a few of them were just obviously not looking towards the teacher. They were looking up in a different area completely. When I went and spoke to some of the pupils and said, "What are you learning about today?" They said, "I've no idea." And when I came out of that classroom, I spoke to a colleague and they said, "As you could see, all the children were really engaged." And I said, "I'm really sorry, were they?" And this person was quite thrown by that question. I was like, how do you know they were engaged? And they couldn't quite articulate that. So I think when we're thinking about our most vulnerable pupils, when we're walking around school and we're dropping in on lessons, checking in on the climate and the culture and gaining a sense check or a heat mapping of what's going on in our classrooms, let's also be looking at our children. And participation is a good lever to consider there. It's not the only thing, because you can be a child that's participating, but you maybe not actually thinking that hard. So we need to get into that and start to see the two sides of that story of what's the teacher doing, what the pupil's doing. And if you start pulling a thread in terms of there's some children here who are not really participating, which means they're not thinking, which means they're not learning. And then we're like, and what else do we know about these children? Oh, these children have additional needs or they're disadvantaged. Then we start to see this kind of important thread that we can be pulling with the teacher or the department or the school once we've done our learning walks around. We're seeing this and we're noticing this. We're noticing that some of our children with additional needs are really not actually actively involved in their learning. They're not thinking hard. That's a bit of an issue. Let's think about that. So that then comes back to the other. Yeah. And that then comes back to the thing about CPD, because the more in tune we are to like the kind of what the sort of teacher issues, for want of a better phrase, like what's going on with the teacher versus the pupil issues in terms of the level of participation, thinking, engagement, then we start to think about diagnostically what should good CPD look like for our teachers in this school and what would a good plan look like. So yeah, and I'm using those terms as participation and engagement very judiciously because sometimes they can be very poor proxies for learning. But hopefully that makes sense in terms of, are the kids thinking? Are they working hard? That's the thing to consider.
I think that's so important point. Actually, in some ways, where I was coming from with that was probably when my experience. I used to do a class check-in every morning. So we had a free-form entry school, primary school. It's quite a big school, but I spent the first half an hour every day just wandering around, seeing what was going on and seeing what the climate was. We called it climate walks.
Yeah,
where I was. And it's just seeing what's happening, talking to the children, finding out just those little bits of, in some ways it is about the culture, isn't it? It's about the culture of what's going on. Are the children participating? Are they active in their learning? Basically what we're trying to look at. And it is hard sometimes what that looked like. And you take other people's and they said, oh, that's a really good lesson. And you think, actually, you go back to that question. What are the children learning in this lesson and how are they learning? Are they improving? And you don't have to improve every lesson, but it gives you a basis of a conversation really then to then say, okay, what are we going to do about it and how you can improve it further?
Yeah.
It does go into the CPD bit, the teaching and learning bit, because actually further on from that is actually training the teachers and the school leaders, especially school leaders as well. What are they picking up when they're doing the learning walks? How are they improving things? Because actually, sometimes we go into this role and we don't really know. It goes back to that question we started off with. What is good teaching? How do your senior leaders and the ones that the middle managers know what good teaching is? Have we got that right? Do we understand it? And it goes through all those sorts of stuff, like cleanse everything from it. A very well structured teaching and learning program is crucial for school, really, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a useful way of you speaking the same language as each other. A lot of people now are using this term codification, aren't they? How are you codifying what effective adaptive teaching looks like in your school? And it goes back to your principles, right? But what we do in the trust where I work, this is the work that I've largely led on with some colleagues in our trust, is around not just codifying. These are our key mechanisms, if you like building culture, securing attention, optimizing communication. We work with Step Lab as an organization. So we've just taken their kind of language and we've built that into what our kind of vision looks like in terms of adaptive teaching. That's the easy bit. What we then give was like, why do we do this? And we share with staff like how that links to executive function, how that links to cognitive load, and how that links to working memory. So you've got the kind of general idea, why that's important, and then we give staff examples of strategies that may look like, and we give them non-examples as well. This is when it's not effective, what you might look like, what you might see here. And that enables us, and we have a framework as well, where once we've done kind of a half-termly check-in on teaching and learning, we can self-assess using a kind of tracker that we have around what we're noticing across the school in terms of what the teachers are doing, what the pupils are doing, and how impactful that is. But I think what you'll tend to find, and I know like people like Tom Sherrington have talked about this and Adam Boxer, I think it's quite a good framework, that what we try and do when we're doing our teaching and learning check-ins across a whole school, and this will be true of one of our small primaries through to one of our secondaries, you can look at kind of three things. You can look at what's going on at the individual teacher level, what's happening there with that class teacher. You can think about the collective issues that are sitting across your school, like commonly occurring patterns. And then you can think about curriculum related issues. And often, this goes back to the subject knowledge one you were saying before, a lot of the time when we're seeing children not accessing their lessons or struggling to access their lessons is maybe because of curriculum decisions that have been made by subject leaders or heads of department. And if the decisions were more effective around the provision of that subject curriculum, you might find that you've got inclusion by design being more successful. So for example, when a head of department or a subject lead will find a really smart way of sequencing a tricky curriculum, so that they've found the optimal way of sequencing, that this is where we should start and this is where we should finish with this medium-term plan. They can then share that with their colleagues and their members of staff, and some of which might be early career teachers. They might not have really good knowledge themselves yet of the subject. So you've got clever, strategic, insightful, proactive curriculum decisions been made that are then supporting their team to be able to deliver more effective teaching and learning. It's not the only thing you should be doing, but it's one of the kind of parts of the pieces of the puzzle that we should consider. So yeah, I think at a leadership level, that's a good thing to keep coming back to.
I totally agree. The other part of within the book is the whole philosophy about I am because you are. And you want to explain more about that and how that builds school communities where every child generally belongs at that school.
Yeah, definitely. And that's Ubuntu, a South African proverb. I am because we are, or I am because you are. And it's this sense of the collective. And I think that what we're possibly in danger of at the moment is allowing the sort of wave of individualism crashing all over us as it currently seems to be. And I'll just give a little bit more insight of that. I'm not against individualism. Equally, I'm not against this idea of collectivism. I think they exist on a spectrum, and sometimes we want a bit of both. Individualism is great because it allows us to celebrate diversity, allows us to fight against social injustice and inequality, and it recognizes where individual harm might be happening and how we support people that may be victims of discrimination and things like that. So individualism is useful. Equally, collectivism is about celebrating not just the person, but the community, and instilling this sense of not me, but we. And it has its pitfalls as well, because sometimes it can miss out the side of individuals that are important. With an example being like schools that celebrate class attendance in primary schools. And sometimes that can be helpful. Sometimes that can be quite destructive. If you've got a child in that class that has a disability or a health concern, which means they can't attend, and then suddenly the whole class is getting punished because of that, if that makes sense. So there needs to be nuance between the two. But I think a really effective inclusive school is one that really finds ways to celebrate the sense of Ubuntu and this collective spirit that can exist in every classroom and every school. So yes, we are different. Yes, we have different needs to an extent. But we can also often find a lot of similarity that exists between us. And that can be cognitive similarity in terms of, yes, I know you've got ADHD and you've got dyslexia and you've got speech and language need, but hey, look, we all more or less actually process and learn things in the same way, and we use our working memory. So we're all cognitively similar to each other. We might just be in a point where we have different strengths or challenges based on that stuff. So that's a part of it. And I think the other thing in terms of inclusion is fighting against this idea of individualism, where we've got this kind of consumer-based culture in our society. People are constantly buying things. We're constantly complaining when things don't go our way. We're too used to the Amazon effect, aren't we, of consumer culture, of you order it now and it arrives tomorrow. And like when that doesn't happen, we start to go a bit crazy about that. And we start the kind of, can I speak to your manager syndrome kicks in, doesn't it? And I think a lot of the people listening to this will attest to the rising level of complaints that we have in schools with people saying, can I speak to your head teacher? Can I speak to your manager? And a lot of the time people are saying, am I getting what I need here? And this is kind of the issue of, am I getting what I need here? And you get a lot of that in the world of SEND as well. And we need to be flipping that to around this kind of sense of not, what are you doing for me? And am I getting what I need here? But this is a team effort. How are we all working together to achieve a common ground? Because we're all fundamentally human beings. And it's, when you look at the research of flourishing that comes out of places like Harvard University, what it means to flourish. And Andy Wolf, Laura Swain write about this in their paper on flourishing as well. You can never flourish individually. You will only be able to flourish together. One person cannot be living a life of luxury and having a great time while all the people around them are floundering and not happy. Like, that's not what happiness is. So in our culture of inclusion, we need to be thinking about the collective spirit driving that individual success so that we're all recognizing each other's strengths as much as possible.
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't expect that answer, but that's such a fantastic answer for what it's all about. Actually, you're totally right with all of that. And that's what we're trying to do, isn't it? At the end of the day, we want everyone to the best they can in schools, and we want to try and support them as best they can. So if you're for a head teacher who's listening to this next week on their drive into work, the one thing you would ask they should do differently to really support children?
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing to do differently to really support their children, I think it's about recognizing the children in your community who are, first of all, not accessing the curriculum and starting to see everything through the prism of those children in particular. And it might be that they're doing this already, and that's great if they are. But if that's not something that currently exists, then that would be one thing that I would encourage people to do, to find a way of more strategically and carefully supporting teachers to think more and work more for those children that are almost in the bottom 25% of the class. And I say that with caution because there's a big misconception around SEND that all children with SEND are low prioriters, and that's just not true. So, that's the kind of caveat to that. But when you think of the principles of adaptive teaching, it's not about teaching to the top. It's about resourcing all children, especially those that struggle the most, to be resourced, to resource them so they can reach the top. And that just flips the narrative a little bit. And when teachers think really hard about the pupils in their class that struggle the most, their teaching just gets better and better. Because to be effective at teaching children who struggle more than anybody else, you have to be a really good teacher, right? You've got to think really hard about how you're going to explain something. What is going to help a child who struggles the most really get this? What's a good explanation going to look like? How am I going to know that they've got it or not? How am I going to make sure they've got opportunity to practice in this lesson, because they need to practice more than anybody? And the more you start to do that kind of stuff as a teacher, the better you become. And this is something that's necessary for those children, but it's useful for all. That's something that all of the children in your class are going to benefit from, of the teacher that's got really clearer insight and enthusiasm around being great at what they do. So there's a bit of it's not a very practical thing. I appreciate that, but this stuff isn't. This is why it's such a leadership challenge, this around adaptive teaching. It's a real kind of mind shift thing to put in place in the strategy that you have in your school.
And in the book, there's so much more in there for school leaders to really take out and use and adapt. As I said, it is a must read if you are a school leader in schools and you want to know how you can support the children with SEND more and be more adapted in your teaching. So it's definitely one for your staff room to have a book club because actually it is such a good book. Where can people get hold of this book and where can they find out more information about what you do?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Because I'm terrible at this kind of stuff. I didn't come into teaching to sell books, but it's just great if people do want to read it. You can buy it on Amazon, all bookstores, Crown House Publishing, the great publishers that have released the book and worked with me on it. So you can buy it directly from their website or Amazon. So please do grab a copy and leave a review if you get the chance. I was at a conference with about 850 people last week and was really amazed, humbled to see in one of the sessions I went to, led by Rachel Ball, who's written another brilliant book called The Scaffolding Effects, that she'd built some of the premise of my definitions of adaptive teaching into that session and built the session around it. And it felt like a really practical kind of way for teachers to think about what Rachel was leading on in that session. So yeah, that kind of stuff will never not feel surreal to me. It's a really amazing place to be when that kind of stuff is happening. But yeah, I'm really pleased that the book is out and people are engaging with it. And so yeah, grab a copy if it's something that sounds interesting and useful.
That sounded like an amazing event. I wished I was at it, but unfortunately as well, there's so much going on there, wasn't it? It's like so many interesting events throughout the day. There was some that I would love to come and see and find out about it, but unfortunately I'd be elsewhere. But yeah, you also, people can find out about Pathfinder CPD as well, can't they?
Yeah, definitely. If anybody is in and around the area of Yorkshire and Humber, we're hoping to do some more work through some of our funded avenues with our adaptive teaching program and some inclusive leadership work for next academic year of 26-27. And we work with schools bespoke as well. So we do bespoke CPD with schools where we have year-long CPD programs, upskilling and supporting staff around adaptive practice. So yeah, if anybody's interested, get in touch.
And you've got a blog,
yeah, I've got when I can and time, and because I still teach as well. So I do work in our trust and I do work for our Teaching School Hub and I teach as well, social sciences. So when I find time, I can sit down and write things and I put them out on my Substack with some blogs that I put on there. So yeah, check them out.
And yeah, as I said, it's such a great book. I'd highly recommend it for anyone to anything about adaptive teaching and SEND, read it because it is so detailed. We had a conversation a while back about this and saying it is so needed at this moment. A really well-researched book. We were talking about an expert, but maybe not for another time or something. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us today. I'm sorry we had a little bit of technical issues in the middle, but what a wonderful podcast. Now, I would love to invite you back in to do another podcast in the autumn term to talk about more of what you're doing and things like that, because there's so much in there. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate you. Thank you.